Haidong! In this video, we're going to talk about HEMA versus Gumdo, open versus closed. As you know, I'm not a fan of clickbaity things, and this was verging on super clickbait. It also verges on getting super focused in on a very niche group, people who have done both Gumdo and HEMA. But here we are, right? So last video we talked about cutting towards the close versus cutting towards the open. And in general, it seemed like the majority of Gumdo cuts towards the close and the majority of HEMA cuts towards the open. Now, so full disclosure, I've spent 15 years training in Gumdo and a few years training in HEMA. So keep that in mind. So if you are a HEMA practitioner and I'm definitely wrong, call me out, right? Because I want to make sure I'm getting things correct and not just what my brain is telling me. But from my experience, this seems to be generally true. And I want to kind of briefly talk about, maybe not so briefly, we'll see, why, right? Because that is a key thing. I want to have that sort of mentality, is like asking why things are the way they are. A sword is a sword, and both a European longsword and a Korean/Japanese longsword are both long swords. So why one versus the other? So at least in terms of Korean fighting style versus European fighting style, so it's going to be a little bit different in Japanese style. Japanese style also tends to be a little bit of a blend of the two, actually. But if you ever look at Taekwondo versus Karate, if you look at Kumdo versus Kendo, and ultimately if you look at Gumdo versus HEMA, it's all about throwing a few quick strikes, ideally one of those doing the damage that you want it to do. As opposed to like in Japanese style, like in traditional karate and with HEMA, you're really kind of hoping that first initial strike is the major ender, and you can always follow it up with a secondary strike. As opposed with Gumdo, like the secondary strike are pretty much equal, maybe a little bit less than equal than our first primary strike. Another aspect is think about the history of the style, right? So in Gumdo prides itself on being like a battlefield scenario, right? So you're kind of like in, not quite an open field, but you're in an open space. You're up against many different opponents. You kind of need to kind of prioritize stability and defense more than really anything else, right? So that's one major difference between Kendo especially, so that's another thing that we're going to reference. Where Kendo is definitely a lot more of a dueling style. It is you versus one other person. And you can really tell that by the way that you move. You really move super linearly, right? Sure, you can move around a target and stuff like that, but once you strike, everything is very linear. And everything is propelled with a great force. So that might be good if you first of all know you have flat ground and you're up against one opponent, that if you throw everything at your opponent, and they can absorb your momentum, which is the idea of why Kendo cuts end straightforward, that works perfectly well. However, so the justification for Gumdo is going to be like, okay, I'm up against allegedly a few different people. I need to prioritize that stability, so cutting towards the close is a little more stable. I would rather be able to cut here, be able to quickly move in another direction, and even move like backwards or whatever you might need to do, like really, really efficiently and really, really quickly. So that is one major reason for that as well. Another thing to keep in mind is the alleged armor level of the people who would be participating, right? So in HEMA, so at least from as much as my historical knowledge would know, you could really use HEMA when you're using full plate armor, chainmail, or really anything anything in between, right? So you have a lot of mass to move around, right? So by using cutting towards the open, which takes a lot more propulsion, right, you can actually move probably more efficiently because you're so much heavier, right? So like from here, actually taking it from on top, right? So if I'm here and I cut with my weapon and use that to help propel me forward, it doesn't really matter how heavy, it matters a little bit. But if I'm wearing a lot of armor, it matters less than if I'm trying to move my body first with a cut, because that's going to require me to, again, move that extra mass around. Versus in, allegedly more ancient Korea, even like the nobility probably didn't have like super heavy, thick steel armor, even if they did wear armor. So the practitioners were usually a lot more lightweight and mobile as opposed to like armor. And another thing to keep in mind, which I find a lot more interesting in a weird way, is actually how resources actually change your perception of both culture and your martial art. So steel was super abundant, especially in Britain, but also like in Europe in general, right? So steel was more readily available. It was higher quality steel. So you could just crank out like good steel swords, good steel armor. Obviously, it still had an expense, but you still had the resources to really, have good equipment. Versus like, so I'm thinking specifically of Japan, but this is my assumption. It's going to be true of the region in general, so I probably including Korea as well. Steel wasn't as available, and what steel you had wasn't as good quality. So like the typical story of like the Japanese steel for katana, right? It was poor quality. You had to like hammer out the impurities over and over, which requires a lot of labor and a lot of steel and a lot of waste and all that stuff to create a single weapon. So you can probably imagine, right? So if you put so much effort into creating this one sword, I don't want to fling all of my momentum, all of my body weight into a single cut, which might be blocked, right? So you can imagine if I have, I spent, my like 3 years salary to get this one weapon, and I'm up against you, and I'm like, bang! And the person's like, no. That's gonna be really disappointing for me, because it's probably gonna damage my sword quite heavily, right? Obviously, I probably would be able to, get a few good cuts in, but you don't want to, invest so heavily in something like that that's gonna break. Versus if you had like enough, resources to, pump out steel pretty quickly, you can invest into a big heavy strike, and even if your sword gets damaged, it's easier to replace it. So kind of just an interesting like how resources kind of influence culture and martial art, but that's another idea. And on that note, because you don't want to damage your weapon, so actually by having a slightly weaker cut, so again we talked about closed cuts are a little bit weaker but a little bit faster, that seems to be good for me as someone who doesn't want to damage my sword, so less impact for me to damage my weapon, but also it's going to let me kind of move in potentially into a soft spot a little more quickly, right? So it damages my sword less, I have a higher probability of landing a secondary cut, so long as I don't die in the first clash, we're probably pretty good. And piggybacking off that is also think about the actual weapons involved, right? So can you stab with this? Yes, it hurts, right? These do not flex. They are very rigid stabbers, very efficient. However, these are better at slashing and cutting, right? As opposed to the traditional longswords they think about, which are still good at cutting and slashing, but they're really, really good at thrusting. So if you think about like what happens when you get into the bind, right? So if you do happen to clash swords and meet in the middle, so from a European perspective with a long straight sword, it is easier, at least from here, just to disengage and just go for a thrust, as opposed to these guys, right? So if we really make contact, sure, you still can do it, but it's not going to be as efficient as cut, disengage, and go on for another slashing motion. So just the weapon itself kind of influencing the type of cut that you do. And in a similar vein is also think about the weight of the weapons, right? So katana, jingum, whatever you might be using for your Korean or Japanese style, are like 2 pounds, right? So about 2 pounds, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on like what flavor you like in your weapon, versus the long swords generally are probably double that, right? So I've seen like, you know, 4 pounds ish for a long sword. So that also dictates what you can do, or not dictates, but helps facilitate your decision in what you want to do. If you have a heavier weapon and you push the heavier weapon first, it's a lot easier for me to move behind it, right? As opposed to if I have a lighter weapon, it might actually behoove me to be more mobile and move my body first to kind of get better geometry, kind of moving around my opponent and be able to slash nice and quickly around it. So it's just another thing that's further creating that divide between these two styles. But ultimately, and this is what I really love about these two styles in particular, they don't contradict each other, right? And in a future video, I kind of talk about why I would actually encourage all Gumdosa to actually practice HEMA as well, and maybe vice versa. Maybe some, maybe any HEMA practitioners want to do some Gumdo as well. But they reinforce each other so beautifully because they don't directly contradict. And in fact, the ideas you learn from one help reinforce ideas from the other, right? So the fluidity and the quick movement in HEMA or in Gumdo reinforced with the idea of technique and being able to disengage and engage in the bind and stuff like that. Is going to be super helpful when you really talk about sparring and application and stuff like that. So yeah, so all in all, it's not really a versus idea, it's just the things that each prioritize, and notice that each of them can synthesize together into something even greater. So in theory, at least that's what I think. With that, so if you do practice any of this stuff, obviously be careful, make sure you're wearing proper equipment because that's important. But make sure you stay safe, stay humble, and keep training and keep learning. Learning is always key. Haidong.